From the Oregon State University's Extension Service, you are listening to In the Woods with the Forestry and Natural Resources Program. This podcast brings the forest to listeners by sharing the stories and voices of forest scientists, land managers, and enthusiastic members of the public. Each episode, we will bring you research and science-based information that aims to offer some insight into what we know and are still learning about forest science and management. Stick around to discover a new topic related to forests on each episode.
All right. Welcome back to In the Woods podcast, presented by the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Program at Oregon State University. I'm Jacob Putney, Extension Agent in Baker and Grant counties, and your host for today's episode. I'm very happy to be joined today by my Extension colleague in Northeast Oregon, Micah Schmidt. Micah is the Northeast Region Fire Specialist, as well as an Assistant Professor of Practice at Oregon State. He joined the Extension Fire Program earlier this year in January, bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience in forest management and fire ecology. Micah holds a Master's in Forest Management from Oregon State University, Bachelor's in Environmental Science and Policy from Southern Oregon University. Micah, it's really great to have you join us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and some of the things you've been working on since you started as Northeast Fire Specialist?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Really happy to be on the podcast today. And yeah, like Jake said, joined the program here in January. And, before doing this, I kind of started my career off in forestry consulting for private landowner down Southwest Oregon. And then eventually decided to get my master's at Oregon State University. And during that time was doing historical fire research, which we'll talk a lot about today, and kind of reconstructing historical fire regimes. Also, working on some silviculture and silviculture related to fire work in my master's. So since I've been here in January, I've been working on a variety of things. Prescribed fire has been a big topic for me. We got a lot of landowners wanting to burn out here in Northeast Oregon and trying to find ways to make that more accessible to folks. And liability is a big issue, so trying to work around a lot of those hurdles. But also been working on some projects to assess private lands across large landscapes and try to get funding in the hands of landowners to do some fuels reduction work, all that good fire prevention and fire preparedness work. I've had a ton of fire this year in Eastern Oregon and a lot across my whole region, so that was a little bit of a welcome to extension type thing to have this record-setting fire season this year. So been doing a lot on the post-fire thing as well to try to figure out how do we restore these landscapes, recover and help people bounce back after their lands have been in a lot of cases really heavily impacted by fire. So that's most of what I've been working on, but there's always new stuff to come and lots of exciting stuff for next year on board. So
I know, I can't believe you've already been here for 10 months. It's gone by so quickly.
Yeah,
I mean, we've already done a number of programs too. It seems like we've had a very busy year.
Yeah, no, it's been really fun, and having you to help me kind of get settled in here has been really great. So we've got a good team out here in the Northeast to work with.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so today we're going to be talking about how we can examine tree rings to give us some insight into the past and reconstruct how forests looked and functioned, including their interaction with fire. Mike has a ton of history and background on this, so I'm excited to dive into this today. But to get us started, why don't we talk a little bit more about some of the terms that folks might have heard before? So let's start with, what is a historical fire regime?
Yeah, so first I'll just touch on the historical part because that word's used in a whole lot of different ways in the natural resources world. So when I'm talking about historical fire regimes, talking about the historical period as in prior to Euro-American settlement in the Pacific Northwest. So we're generally talking prior to 1850s to 1900s. So, settlement and the suppression of fire started generally in that time frame. In other areas, a little bit more in the early 1900s. But talking about that period before Euro-Americans kind of started coming in and really altering the environment and the fire regimes. And the word fire regime also has a lot of different uses, but basically using it to describe, how fire would have burned historically in that period, back when lightning and indigenous people were igniting fires. So with the historical fire regime, we're generally looking at the frequency. So how often did fire burn on a particular site? How many years in between each fire? The severity. So how many trees were killed and how heavy were the impacts on a site? So we generally talk high severity fires kill most of the trees in the stand, whereas low severity fires may kill a few trees, but generally aren't going to kill that many of them. And those are also related to soil impacts, impact on other understory vegetation, but those are a little bit harder to get at with the tree ring work we're going to talk about today. I'm also looking at seasonality. So what time of the year did fires burn? And so, spring burning was used in some cases, oftentimes for grassland and oak burning and such. But the majority of our fires in Oregon generally were, in the fall or late summer when fuels were dry and ready to burn. So seasonality is another part of that fire regime. And then the spatial extent, how large of areas did fires burn? And that one's really hard to get at, but we can kind of gain some inferences from some of the work we do. But it's really nice to have those things there because those can kind of characterize historical fire regime. We can use that to compare to like what's happening currently. Are fires the same size? Are they happening more frequent, less frequent? They happening, different times of year than they would historically. And that can, help us inform how to manage our vegetation because a lot of the vegetation across Oregon is adapted to different types of fire regimes. So if we change how fires are burning and when they're burning, that can have a lot of implications for how plants grow and how we as a society interact with fire.
So along those same lines, then, what is historical range of variation? That's a term we hear a lot, or HRV.
Yeah, and that can be a loaded term. Of course, Forest Service uses that a lot and definitions kind of vary, but generally we're looking at in that historical period, so prior to the 1850s, 1900, the range of forest conditions that would have existed on the landscape. And so that can be, both within a stand. So it can be, what were generally the dominant trees in, say, a ponderosa pine forest versus the mixed conifer forest. It could also be, how was the landscape separated into different vegetation and different age classes. So maybe, 25% of the landscape was old growth ponderosa pine forest in this area of interest. Maybe 30% was, young mixed conifer forest or lodgepole. But basically gives you, a whole range of, what existed there in what stages of development were they in, young, middle age, old, what species were there, all that kind of stuff. And it can be really variable depending on, which natural resources professional is using this term. Forest Service has some specific ways they use it versus how we use it in the research world. But yeah, generally that range of forest conditions and the diversity that existed on the landscape historically.
So kind of given those two terms, I mean, how can we look into the past and kind of get a sense of what these are by examining things like tree rings?
Yeah, so we are super lucky in the forest land world that we have trees to record things over time. In shrub and grassland ecosystems, there's often, not that luxury. So trees, record an annual reading each year. They have early wood, which basically develops in the early part of the growing season, so spring, early summer. And that transitions to a darker wood color. Generally, it's called a late wood. And that happens in the late summer, fall. It's growing season's kind of coming to an end. But these rings are strongly correlated to climate. So we can look back and say, in general, larger growth rings corresponded with a year with a better growing season. So more rain, maybe some cooler temperatures on each side of the growing season. But anything that, contributes to trees growing, whereas real thin, skinny rings, not as much tree growth would be in those harsher drought years, or maybe years where we had colder conditions on each end, trees didn't start growing as fast. But since these rings are strongly correlated to climate, we can compare rings across different trees, and over time, we can actually, designate the actual growing year of each ring on a sample we get in the vast majority of cases. And so tree rings also, scar due to injury, mechanical damage, frost cracks, or fire. And since we're able to precisely date each ring and attach a year to each growth ring on a tree, we can also date these injuries. And we have some, indicators to tell you what those may be. Was it actually fire that damaged this? Was there a frost crack? Was it mechanical damage or injury? And I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, since we have this record, and in some cases going back thousands of years, if you look in the case of, redwoods or, some of the old bristlecone pine and such. But for most of our trees in Oregon, we're looking generally in spans of a few hundred years to, around 1,000. So given that we precisely date those, we have this whole record over time, and it gives us, some instances when some fire events or other injuries and stuff did occur.
So if you're interested in a particular area, a particular forest type, what is the general process for determining where and what to sample?
Yeah, that can be a challenge because there is so much diversity across our landscape, especially over here in Eastern Oregon, lots of different vegetation types and such, and lots of different fire regimes within our ecosystems. So, I'd first say it kind of depends on the research objectives. Historically, when fire history research was first starting, someone may have said, I just want to go out and figure out what's the fire regime of this particular vegetation type or this particular place that's important to me for some reason. So you had a lot of fire history happening in ponderosa pine forest where we can visually see the cat faces of scars and such. Commonly now, we tend to want to sample across a gradient of forest conditions, to kind of gain inferences on, how fire regimes change over different vegetation types and different sites, different elevations, precipitation, all that kind of stuff. And so, in some of the recent studies I've been a part of, we've said we're going to take this landscape where we know there's a bunch of different forest types, and we're going to put a grid of, 16 to 20 sites on there. And we're going to ensure those grids line up with the range of forest types so that we can say at these low elevations where we have this type of forest, maybe they burn more frequently or they have lower severity fires. Whereas we move up to a different elevation, maybe there's a different fire regime there. That's kind of how we figured out. But, really, again, comes back to research objectives. But within those research areas, one thing that we found to be the most effective way to reconstruct historical fire regimes is we need some tree rings to collect, and tree cores don't really show you, fire scars in a reliable way. You don't always capture the scar when you're coring a tree, and often, you can't tell exactly what year fire burned. So we go to old clear cuts. Across the 1800s, they were clear cutting like crazy across all of Oregon. So we go to those areas that have old clear cuts that are also hopefully adjacent to an unmanaged forest that would have been similar to that stand before it was cut. And so we go to those old stumps that were cut decades ago, and a lot of times, especially in ponderosa pine, but also in other species like Doug fir, that wood's still intact because, when fire burned, it stimulated a pitch response. So the resin started flowing in the tree, and that resin hardened and basically retained the structural integrity of the wood. So then we go in and we actually, cut samples from those old stumps. So that way we don't go out actually cutting down any old growth trees. No, I wouldn't want to do that. And so we use that, and we get those, and then we compare that to the current forest in the unmanaged area. So we can kind of make some inferences like, okay, the historical fire regime was this is what kind of fires we caught. And this is what this unmanaged area, the area has never been logged, looks like. So we can kind of say that fire regime, probably led to some forest conditions similar to that of that unmanaged adjacent area.
Okay. And so you mentioned, old clear cuts, and you mentioned cap faces as well. Is those kind of the key things you're looking for when you're kind of looking for a stump to sample or a particular area to sample? Is there any other key things you look for when choosing a study site or a sample tree?
Yeah, we definitely want to have some older stumps, because if we do just have young trees that were cut that maybe had regenerated after fire suppressions, say in the early 1900s, and they cut them 60 years later, that really doesn't help us recreate that historical age variation. So in general, larger trees are older, although that is really variable across the landscape. Can't have small trees that just grew really slow. So we try to look for larger stumps while also, trying to sample some of the smaller ones in there. But depending on what forest type and species you're looking at, it can be a lot easier or harder. So we really like trees with visual cap faces or scars. So if those cap faces are there, which is basically, at the base of a stump or a tree, you'll often see a cavity, and often it's blackened from char from actual fires. You can actually even count the fire scars from the outside of the tree there. So if we see that, we'll definitely cut into that because we know there's fire scars there. But say you're, in a forest with, maybe it's Doug fir or spruce or something like that. They don't usually have as many visually available cap faces. So there, we just have to kind of go through, look for the stumps that probably have intact wood, which can be challenging because sometimes, like a Doug fir stump can have 6 inches of moss on top of it, and you cut into it and it's actually a solid wood, believe it or not, inside there. And for those, we end up just cutting a ton of stumps open, hoping we get lucky. And so we might cut 30 or 40 stumps open at a site and take 15 or 20 samples from just the best trees there. I don't know how to explain it, but people I worked with kind of feel the same way. You tend to kind of get a feel for where the fire scars are, and then you end up, losing that feel as you move somewhere else and such. I often kind of look for, deformities, on the tree. Maybe there's a canker or something else that may have been formed by an injury or a scar or something like that too. But when it really comes down to it, you just end up cutting up a bunch of stumps within your site, and you have a radius around that site that you're allowed to cut in. So we're not cutting too large of an area where we can't actually make inferences about that historical fire regime. But yeah, you cut a bunch of them open and you get lucky enough times, and then you probably end up going back to that site later after you've processed all the samples to kind of fill in the gaps that you may have missed.
Yeah. And well, it sounds like ponderosa pine with the cap face would be like the best case scenario. Are some species easier to work with than others?
Yeah, you hit it with the ponderosa pine. They are super easy, and there's cap faces all over the place in dry forest. So it's really fun. And sometimes, we'll find 25 scars or so on the same tree. I think the record, something up in British Columbia, ponderosa pine had like 56 fire scars or something like that. So a ton on one tree. Some other pines like lodgepole can be okay for this. If you're in a lodgepole forest that had a lower severity fire regime, to where some lodgepole pine have that boom and bust cycle where they destroys all the trees, so there goes all your evidence. But in lodgepole pine that had more frequent fire, they can be okay for scarring. Douglas fir is actually more reliable than you'd think. Even on the west side with that huge thick bark, we'll find a lot of scars in there, but definitely not as reliable as ponderosa pine. And there's actually been, a study done, I think it was in Arizona, where they had actual record of where and when fires burned over the last 100 years or so. And they went out and, reconstructed the fire regime using ponderosa pine scars as well. And those lined up really well. So it was kind of giving credit to the methodology that the scars are reflecting what the fires burned. Douglas fir and other species, not really been a study done like that. So we don't know, how many of the fires were catching. But, if you sample enough trees, you hope that you get, at least most of them and keep the door open to there being more fire than you found. But, Douglas fir is pretty good. Other trees like grand fir, white fir, some of the cedars and such can be challenging because when they scar or get injured, they tend to rot from that scar in. And so, if you ever are out cutting cedars or, true firs and such, you'll notice there's a lot of rot in the middle. That was the same thing, back when fires were burning more frequently. And so those we try to avoid if possible. They also have a bunch of growth distortions because they tend to, buttress out and have a bunch of different growth patterns. So those ones are not as great. So ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and to a lesser extent, western larch and lodgepole are generally what we try to get after.
Mhm. So let's say you go out and you collect a bunch of samples. Do you bring these back to a lab, and how do you process them in order to get these data?
Yeah, so the processing is, really labor intensive, and it's one reason why, these fire history studies have been going on for some decades now, but we still have a lot of areas where we haven't done these. That's because it costs so much to do all this work. There's a ton of work after you actually drive all the way to the site, collect the samples. When we take a cross section, so, a piece of a stump with the tree ring sample out from the field, oftentimes they're falling apart, and they're like where there's fire scars, they might break there because there's a little break in the ring and such. So we wrap those up in plastic wrap and then bring them back to the lab. And so the first thing is we got to maintain the sample integrity by having the sample number and the other data that we collect, the location, the species, all that kind of stuff. But we also got to make sure these samples are going to stay together when we actually start sanding and processing them. So we'll take either caulk or wood glue, and we'll glue the samples together. The ones that are semi-sound, you can just glue them to themselves. Other ones, we actually glue them down to a piece of OSB plywood, so we can make sure, as we're processing them, pieces aren't going flying everywhere, which they still do on some rotten samples. But then we used to just take a belt sander and start belt sanding away and getting them flat, because a nice flat surface is really important for cross dating under the microscope. But now, towards the end of my time in the tree ring lab at OSU, we had a jointer and a planer. So samples that were intact enough, we'd send them to the jointer and planer, get them flat, and then we just use an orbital sander and sand them down to a really fine grit, often all the way down to 400 grits. So you could really see those rings under the microscope. And so after we sand them, that's when we take them into the tree ring lab. And if you do this a lot, you can often visually cross date these samples. And if the rings are big enough, you don't need a microscope. If they are too small, you do need a microscope. And you can actually look at the patterns of, drought years and good growing years over time. And it's really consistent for trees that are growing nearby each other. And so we cross date those, and then we measure every single ring on every single sample into the computer using this big AccuGauge microscope measuring deal. It's a really cool piece of equipment. And so we measure all those. So gosh, I couldn't even tell you how many thousand rings each of us, in the work treatment lab measured. But once we get those measured in, then we'll actually, visually identify the scars, determine if they're fire or maybe mechanical injury or something else, and put those into a database. And once we have all those samples, that's when we'll actually start doing the analysis and start describing the historical fire regimes.
So a little sidebar, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I spent a summer right before I started my master's program collecting tree cores from a watershed study site on the west side, and 5th acre plots, and I cored every single tree for all the plots across that watershed, and then went back and mounted and sanded each one of them. And man, talk about cores falling apart and just sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding to get them smooth enough. And then there was a lot of alder too, which is just so hard to try to date because the rings are different than some of our conifer species. But yeah, it was fun, but man, that was a lot of work.
No kidding. It's really, really eye-opening when you actually see what goes into some of this type of work.
Oh, and after all that, just trying to count all those rings too, and then just having no idea what I was doing when it comes to dating them.
They could be a crazy maker, that's for sure.
So you mentioned looking at some of the different widths of the rings and stuff to kind of cross date them. How else can you kind of key in on, if you really don't know when this tree was cut, or you're not getting kind of the consistency on the rings to be able to date them? What are some other kind of ways that you can try to figure out when exactly this ring was, or this fire scar at this particular time?
Yeah, so the vast majority of samples we take from stumps, but the outer ring is not intact, like you mentioned. That's because, they've been sitting there for decades. And, oftentimes it's interesting, like for pine, they tend to rot back to the outer scar because that's where the last pitch response was. So you lose, anywhere from a few rings from when it was cut to, decades worth. And some of our samples, the outer ring ends up being a few hundred years ago, because we lost all that wood, or it's a dead tree that just stayed standing for a long time. What we do. So if you're in a new area and you don't have a database of like cross-dated samples that you can compare your rings to, we always try to take at least a few tree cores. And in many studies, this fire history stuff also coincides with kind of reconstructing that historical range of variation. So you're also coring living old trees and seeing what's out there now. But with tree cores, you know the outer rings, when you cross-date them, as long as they don't fall apart on you, you don't know where the outer ring is anymore. So what you do is you take those ones, you cross-date a bunch of those, or basically just count the rings back from that beginning. Maybe you cored it in 2020, so you know that outer ring is 2020. And you try to get some old trees so you can start creating a record going back several hundred years. And you got to do a bunch of these tree cord because, especially where there are fire scars or bad growing years, sometimes rings kind of disappear. Maybe where you cored, you actually didn't see a couple of the rings. So you take a bunch of these and you start getting confident that you have like a good database of measured ring widths. And we have this really cool statistical software called Cofecha, and it was developed back in the 70s or 80s, a long time ago. We still use it. It actually takes all those ring measurements that you counted in or measured in, and then it compares them and does a bunch of fancy statistical stuff that's way over my head. And it basically tells you how correlated those are. If you start off with the wrong outer ring on every core, you're not going to be on the right there. But, as long as you do your due diligence, know your outer ring and such, Cofecha will take all this information and it'll start creating, a record, and that record's, kind of correlated to climate over time. And so even if every tree didn't respond to climate the same way, in each individual year to like the dry or wet years, good or bad growing seasons, it'll start kind of averaging those and normalizing those so that you can have a record that you can compare trees that are similar, rings that are similar, but not quite the same. And so once you have that whole database developed, you can use that in measuring your rings from, say, a cross section where you don't know the outer ring. And then Cofecha will give you all of these recommendations for, it's this much correlated to this time frame, and generally goes in like 50-year segments. So it'll say, this 50-year segment is highly correlated to 1850 to 1900, and so be it. And then using that, as well as just like a knowledge of cross dating and a knowledge of, true ring science and such, we can basically narrow it down until we feel really confident that we actually have the right rings. And sometimes this can take a long time. Most samples we can do pretty quickly, but there's times when, we've had several of us sit for days, on one single sample and just throw it aside, bring it out another time, throw it aside, bring it out another time. And the more samples you get, the more you keep building that database, and the more Cofecha software can tell you, this is probably what you're looking at. So it's it can be challenging. There's still samples out there we haven't cross-dated, but we're able to cross-date well over 90% of the samples using, both visual and then Cofecha to help us kind of rebuild that tree ring network.
No, that's super cool. And like you said, I imagine, the more and more data you could collect, you can start to get some really accurate estimates for, a pretty broad region.
Yeah, definitely. And then they use this, tree ring stuff going way back in time. They'll take, ancient civilizations and such, and they'll take like the wood posts. They'll actually cross-date those posts and then combine them maybe with carbon dating or other stuff. And so they can use it to, reconstruct when people were in different places. If you have records going back, it's also been used in New Zealand. They had a tree, they found it in a bog. And it actually, I don't know what the evidence looked like, but it had evidence of the last magnetic pole shift in the tree rings of that tree because it was ancient. So it's really amazing what you can do with that stuff.
Yeah, no kidding.
Mm-hmm.
So from the research you've been involved with, what would you say is the most interesting thing you found?
Yeah, there's so many interesting things, but I think for me, just like the amount and the frequency of fire is the most interesting thing across all of Oregon. And so like, I've always been a strong believer fire touches, all of our vegetation, historically, impact all of our vegetation types in one way or another. It looked really different across the state and across different sites. And of course, you have areas that didn't burn when the surrounding areas burned as much. But, almost everywhere we've looked, been kind of surprised at how frequent fire is. Even, looking at the Western Cascades and the Coast Range where, conventional knowledge tells you it was all stand replacing high severity fire, like what we saw in the 2020 and Labor Day fires. The story's a lot more nuanced. Those big fires were a part of it. There were also a lot more low to mixed severity fire throughout the development of those stands. And each different type of fire kind of leads to, different outcomes and different development of the stands. I've always think as a core of my mentorship and silviculture in my career, it's like stands can take so many different developmental pathways and such. And fire just mediates those pathways and changes them and can come out with like lots of really unique conditions across the landscape, even in sites that are really similar otherwise. And so I just think, seeing how much of a role fire played and communicating that to people and seeing people's eyes light up when they say, wow, this burned that frequently or this did that, and we can use that to inform our management. I think that's some of the most interesting and fun stuff for me.
Yeah, definitely. So, you collect a bunch of samples from live trees and from these dead trees in an area. You start to look at, what that fire return interval might have been and try to get some sense of like the extent and the severity and the seasonality and the things you mentioned earlier. But, how do you take that next step to try to see what the kind of historical structure and composition of the forest might have been?
Yeah. So with that, that's generally where tree cores and, just some type of research inventory plots come in, and those generally play a role, in those unmanaged areas adjacent to where we collect our tree ring samples that I mentioned earlier. So what we'll do there is you'll go into a plot and, similar to what you were saying, you were dealing with coring a bunch of trees. You'll go in, core all the trees in the area, and we'll cross date those, and you'll start to get a sense for, how old different trees are and what the, species and age composition was. And then you can actually look at the tree rings and say, okay, these trees that we cored established prior to what we'd say American settlement or fire suppression era. So say, this many trees established in the 1500s versus the 1700s, and so you can actually talk about, what trees and species were there before fire suppression happened. And that is definitely true of the large trees and such. You can imagine, though, over the course of 100 or 150 years of fire suppression, some of those smaller trees may have fallen over, decomposed, especially in the, in the moisture forest. So you don't get the, the full complete picture, but it's the best we have. And it puts together a pretty complete picture by saying, okay, in this area, and nowadays after this area's been clear cut and haven't had fire, it's like a even age Doug fir forest. But historically, it had, 500-year-old ponderosa pine, and then it had 200-year-old Douglas fir in the, in the mid-story. But, you know what I mean? But you can start to say, which species and which trees were here historically based on when the tree ring said. Then you can often look and say something we see on the east side is grand fir and or white fir. You'll see a bunch of those in the stand, but you start tree coring them, and even if they're big trees, they are often pretty young, relative to all the older trees. So they can be, anywhere from 80 to 120 years old or so. And that tells you that those trees basically established after fire suppression. And the thought is that it's likely that if fire kept burning, those trees would not have survived because they're, fire intolerant. They
Right.
don't like fire that much and stuff. So as we do that, if you do enough plots across the landscape, you can take your broad forest types that we talk about, moist mixed conifer, dry mixed conifer, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, whatever it may be. And you can start rebuilding the range of conditions that occur in each one of those types as long as you have enough plots. So, and that kind of gets at, same with the fire history, we want to do that across a gradient because, especially on our national forest lands, they manage across all those different vegetation types in most cases. And even private landowners, they may not have all of them on the property, but across the whole private land, matrix, all those vegetation types tend to exist, except maybe some of the alpine ones in some cases. But that kind of helps you get at that. We can also look at the increment growth on those cores, and so like how much it was growing each year, and that can give you an idea of like historical basal area, historical density. So you can say, there was about this much density at this point in time, and then as it got older, it went to this density, and that can kind of help inform our current management and what density we might want to manage for if restoring the historical forest is an objective for a given site.
Right. No, that's really interesting. I'm always fascinated by, what these forests look like long prior to when we got here.
Yeah.
I know you're still involved with some of this research. What would you say are some of the future goals or some of the next steps for this work is?
Yeah. So now that I'm an extension role, I don't do coadjuvant research, but I am still involved, like you said. So still some of my colleagues are working on, continuing to reconstruct the fire regimes and historical forests, that composition and structure in the moist forests of the Western Cascades and Coast Range. So I'm not quite as much involved in that, but I know there's, a ton of questions since conventional knowledge told us those were long unburned systems that eventually burned down at a high severity. So I know they're trying to reconstruct that because there's a big interest in our society across all forest types. How do we continues to develop, protect old growth forests, and acknowledging, a lot of our old forests in the dry side are in pretty rough condition and may not have, a lot of life in some of those old trees, because they've been overcrowded and dense for so long. We want to figure out, what kind of a fire regime developed these type of old growth forests, so we know how to emulate those with silviculture. And, acknowledging we're never going to emulate those historical fire regimes across the whole landscape. We're never going to, restore historical forest conditions everywhere. It can be a guide, and we can acknowledge that, even if we can't have fire, like a lot of our, ecosystems evolved with, say, if it's a frequent low severity fire regime, they evolved with a frequent low severity disturbance regime. So we can emulate that with our silviculture and our other things to say, maybe we come in here more frequently, disturb it a little bit more often, and it'll, maybe we can get some of those benefits of the historical fire regime. But I think my goal now is just to make this information as practically useful as possible in an extension role. Almost all of this work is only presented in an academic context and research publications, webinars, and such like that. So I'm hoping to, make it a little bit more real, and really like going out field tours and showing people those calf faces on the ponderosa pine and say, hey, look, this area is super dense with dead fir, grand fir now, but historically it was a ponderosa pine forest. Look at all these scars. So I kind of view that as my role now, how to make this practically useful to both landowners, the general public, and land managers, so that even if we can't restore those historical fire regimes, we can use it to, kind of help guide our management in a more ecologically sensitive way.
Yeah, I think that would be incredibly useful. I mean, there's been a lot of fascinating work that's been done, and some of the results, they surprise me every time I see a new publication come out about them. We really scratched the surface. There's so much more we could talk about too, especially some of those interesting results. But unfortunately, we're going to be nearing the end here today, but I don't want to miss anything important. So do you have any parting thoughts on some of the tree ring research and reconstructing these fire histories and looking at the historical range of variation?
Yeah, there's one thing I like to tell people is that, we walk in the forest. I'm guilty of it, and many of us are. We generally look at the trees, and we're trying to look at what's going on here. And not to mention all the understory vegetation, the other stuff we're missing. But the other thing I just encourage people, look towards the ground, and, with this information presented today, look to see, are there old stumps around here that were cut at some point? If you're in a managed forest, or are there not stumps? Why aren't there stumps? Why aren't there? And I find it's really cool because you start to develop, the stump record can be lost with a fire that comes through, or a couple fires and burns them off, or maybe for some reason they pulled out stumps historically. But I think it's really cool to look around, because what I often see is the species composition now does not match what it was historically. And in some of these areas, you're like, wow, this is really wet and moist, feels pretty cool in here. And suddenly you see a ponderosa pine stump with a bunch of fire. And so how, that can kind of give you some inferences on like, what did this site look historically? You can kind of rebuild that tree in your mind, looking at the stump. That's a big old growth tree. And just kind of look at it and think of the woods in a little bit different way. And think about, if you were walking out here 200 years ago, what it might have looked like. And I think it'll give you a little bit different look and idea of, what you're doing out there in the forest land. And obviously, we got to look at what is there now, but looking what was there historically can help inform our management decisions. So that's probably the parting thought I'd leave you with there.
No, definitely. I'm guilty of it as well. I spend a lot of time looking up when I'm walking out in the woods, but I do really enjoy, finding these old stumps, and especially if they have cool springboard notches in them or things like that. And then kind of looking across the landscape and trying to see, what did this forest look like 100, 200, 500 plus years ago,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Micah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Like I mentioned, I find this fascinating. I really enjoy this work. Reconstructing the past has challenged some of our previous notions on fire ecology, can really help inform future decisions. And I really liked your point about, how do you make this useful to communicate and kind of tell that story. I know we discussed a lot today, so if any questions came up while you were listening, or if you'd like to learn more, please drop us a comment or send us a message on our website. And before we wrap up, Micah, we'd like to do what we call our lightning round, or where we ask a few questions of our guests. So kicking off with the first one here, what is your favorite tree?
Well, I got to give you two, because I grew up in Southwest Oregon, and there's no way I can't say sugar pine. They are just, to me, the coolest tree ever. Something that's a lot less abundant than it used to be. So when you come upon an old growth sugar pine, it's like, wow. But the other one, since I'm in Eastern Oregon now and I don't get sugar pine anymore, is Western larch, which I know is the favorite of a lot of people, but there's just nothing better than, in fall time when you go driving through the woods or walking through the woods and you just see that whole blanket of gold covering the canopy. So I'd say those two on the west and east side are probably my favorite.
No, those are good. Those ones are hard to beat. I actually have a couple of sugar pine cones sitting in my office here. They're fascinating species as well.
Hey, maybe that's our next tree to start planting out here, huh?
Maybe. All right. The next question here is, what is the most interesting thing you bring with you in the field?
Yeah, so I don't bring a ton of interesting stuff because I'm one of those people that likes to go as light as I possibly can. But one thing, since I really enjoy prescribed burning, one thing I find really useful is an infrared camera. So I have this little, it's about the size of a phone and it has an infrared sensor on it. And so you can actually walk around and, number one, it's really great for mop up. You can see where stuff's still hot and burning. So you can make sure your fire's not going to escape later. But it's really cool just to show people while fire is burning, sit there with someone who hasn't really watched fire before, have them look at their eyes and look what the infrared camera is showing and look where that heat's transferred and such like that. So I find that really cool. And then for the mop up side, it's a lot more fun using that camera than walking around with your bare hand on the dirt trying to feel hot spots. So
I always find it interesting too, is like looking at just the vegetation on a hot day, is how hot that vegetation could get and how that heat's moving around.
Yeah, it's amazing, huh?
Mm-hmm. All right. And then lastly, what resources would you recommend to our listeners if they're interested in learning more about dendrochronology, historical fire regimes, or historical range of variation and some of the research that's come out of the Tree Green Lab?
Yeah. So, the research is where most of it is. So you can, if you go onto Google Scholar and just type in historical fire regimes, that'll take you to a lot of it. I worked a lot with James Johnston and Andrew Marshall. They have a lot of good research. Look up their names. Emily Heyerdahl is another person. Lots of great, great researchers out there doing this stuff. But outside of the research, there's not a ton of information, but, you can, most of your, extension foresters, regional fire specialists in your region, if you reach out to them, they, all of us have a pretty good, good knowledge of ecology and historical fire and can point you to resources there. What we have over here, we put out our spring edition of Light from the Dry Side a few months back. And if you look on that, I have a write-up on historical fire regimes and range of variation. We're also, we have this upcoming webinar series this winter that you and me, Jake, and several other people are going to be doing. And I'm going to present on historical fire regimes, how we reconstruct them. Then we're going to have a bunch of experts on specific vegetation types go into those. So I'd really encourage, watching that webinar. Other than that, there's not a lot of information out there. So if you have a desire to have more information for your region, I would say reach out to your local extension person and say, hey, we might want some of this. And I'm sure we could all work together to put something together there.
Yeah, definitely. That was a great article you wrote for the Life on the Dry Side newsletter. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation for that webinar series as well. So we'll make sure to get those linked to the website.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it should be fun.
All right. Well, thank you again for being here today, Micah. So glad to have you in the Northeast, and I look forward to continuing to work together with you. We still need to get out and go cut some samples of our own so we can have something to show folks about looking at these old fire scars. Well, this concludes another episode of In the Woods. Thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and we will see you all next time. Bye, everyone.
The In the Woods podcast is produced by Lauren Grand, Jacob Putney, and Scott Levengood, who are all members of the Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension team. Other members of the team who've been involved in the podcast include Carrie Berger, Jason O'Brien, and Stephen Fitzgerald. Episodes are edited and produced by Carrie Cantrell. Music for In the Woods was composed by Jeffrey Heino, and graphic design was created by Christina Freihoff. Funding for In the Woods is provided by Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension, the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and the USDA Renewable Resources Extension Act funding. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we can't wait to talk to you again next month. Until then, what's in your woods?